Hello, in today's video we're going to try and swap this spring on the motor. I've already done this one. Um, this is part of that same series, going to the 600 lift Z28 style spring and that flat retainer. I have a stem seal available here. I have keepers. I tend to run new keepers. You don't have to. The factory keepers will fit this retainer. It's a standard 7-degree GM keeper. You will need a magnet to try and help get the keepers out. And in this case, I'm just using a basic Harbor Freight, like $11 spring compressor. It's just a manual spring compressor. Now, we are going to air up the cylinder. I've got shop air here. I've got a line plugged in place of the spark plug, and that puts pressure up on the valve to help hold it in place. Now, I also have a flywheel lock on this motor to keep it from rotating over. You may find when you apply air, especially depending on what your pressure is, that the piston may want to walk itself down. Most of the time they don't, but it can happen. But you just maintain air pressure on it, and then your first goal is to try and get this guy onto the spring. Now, Cadillac springs have a progressive coil at the bottom, and so it's a little tough to get it in, but you want to get it in and try and center it here because you need to be able to get those keepers out, and then you just start twisting the top, and that's going to compress the spring. And you look down at it and make sure that you are centered, and just keep going. Now you're basically going to go until this stops because you want it as compressed as you can. Now I'm kind of holding up on it, not a lot of pressure, but I don't want it to just drop down because I want to be able to get the keepers on my terms and not lose them. And especially if you're doing this on the car, you want. Okay, this is solid. The spring is sitting off of the seat. I'm still against the keeper. So now I'm going to push down and try and get these keepers, there's one, out, and there's two out, okay? Now, have something to put them on. I'm using a tray here, but, you know, something, a bucket, something so you don't lose track of parts. And the magnet will help. I mean, if a keeper falls, most of the time it just falls right here into the head. But if that doesn't happen, it may fall all the way down to the ground. That's part of the reason I always have new keepers on hand. But you could, if you want, put something, a pad or something in here that will catch it so it doesn't fall all the way through if you lose the keepers. The biggest problem is losing track of those little keepers. Now, once you get it off, you got to get past the stem seal. If they're old and brittle, that can be a little tough. Remember, these are fairly new. Now you can see I didn't quite compress the whole spring because I couldn't really dig down in here. But when I go to this spring, I want to try and compress it as much as I can because I got to get those keepers back in. Now we have the valve sitting here up. It's being held by air. And the next thing we have to do is put one of the stem seals on. Now I'm going to take the spring off of this tool. Now part of the reason I can use such a basic tool is because these springs are not very tough. You get into some of the bigger springs and you might need something with some lever action in order to make it happen. So I'm going to take one of the stem seals, and if you notice, I'm putting my finger kind of against the valve. This is just to try and help for me not pushing down on the valve as I try and get this seal past the lip of the keeper spot. And then I'm just going to push it all the way down. Okay? Now, we've already taken a look on the other head. We know that our basic combination is going to work. So now all I have to do is get the new spring on. Now, you want to walk this tool pretty far, whoops, back up. Of course, I dropped the retainer. Sorry about that. So, again, that's why you might want to have something to catch stuff. So you slide this retainer with spring into the spring. Now if you look, you may have to go here. If you look, these are offset. So you're not going to be able to go on the same coil. And that's part of the reason why you're trying to stay centered when you're fussing with this thing. So once you get it close and as far down as you can, you center the top so that you can get the keepers in. And then you tighten this thing all the way up again because you want that spring as compressed as you can get. Okay? Now, you need enough room to have the keeper. If you don't go down far enough, you may not have enough room. And you'll know that as soon as you put it on. So if you set this on, and again, try not to push down on the valve, you can decide if you have enough room. Now in this case, I didn't grab low enough. I really need to be down here. So I got to work this back up. And it's a little easier when you're working on the new spring. I can just rotate this a little bit to be further down on the spring. Okay, see I'm sitting a little lower on the spring. Make sure that all the legs are sitting right. Make sure you're sitting right here so you can get to the keepers. And then you go back to tightening it up again. And this should give me enough room that I can get those keepers in. This whole time I have air running. So my compressor in the back is running. And I am putting air in there. Because you will have some leak by it. It's not like it's going to hold. So you really got to have an air source available that will keep supplying you. Okay? See, I've got that way shorter now. And if you look, I can get to the keeper. Now again, I'm using the magnet and going on to the top of the keeper. Part of that is because my fingers are a little big. If you have the ability to reach in there, that's great. But I also like having the magnet because it really holds on to the keeper. Things can slip out of your fingers and the magnet helps. And you go in here until you feel it lock. And then you hold it up. Whoop. Went a little too far up. Not everything goes perfect. This takes some patience. So, put the keeper in. We'll grab another one here. Put the other keeper in. I'm sitting a little low. There we go. Now it's sitting up. And then you pull up on the spring compressor. That holds the keeper in place because you don't want the keeper to move around on you. And so while you're holding up on this, then you start taking the spring tension off of the spring. And that will extend the spring out and allow it to hold it in place. That gets it off and the spring is in place. Now, once you get that off, look at the keeper. Make sure that they look like they're sitting correctly, you know, that nothing's loose, that you're not going to drop anything. At the moment, you have air holding the valve up. So if you look in and you see something wrong, now's the time to fix it before you let the air go. If you start fussing around with other stuff and that one happens to pop out a keeper, drop the valve down, you don't want that. So you really got to look at it, make sure they're well seated. In this case, they're flush. It looks just like the one next to it. It feels good and tight. So at that point, you're done with the air, and that valve is done. Now, depending on how you're doing this, if you're doing it with air, you'd move to the next cylinder. Some people, I've seen them do it with rope. I had a roommate that always did it with rope, and that's fine. You just got to be a little careful with the rope. You know, it can get stuck in there. Think about what you're doing. You can also do it without the flywheel lock. In this case, I will probably bring the next piston up so that it's towards TDC. That way, if I screw something up, the valve can't necessarily drop all the way into the bore. Now, worst case scenario, if you mess up, you're pulling ahead and you're having to do a head gasket. So it's not the end of the world. And sometimes I find that pulling ahead is an easier thing. You can do this on the bench. You don't have to struggle with all this. But I know a lot of you guys have running motors and you want to do it on the car, on the motor, without taking anything apart. And it can be done. And it's not a very expensive tool. You just need that and a magnet. Make sure you have everything ready to go so that you can do it fairly quickly. You could even buy a couple of these and have one ready to go, and as soon as you pull the spring, you're popping the new one on. With some help, you could get it into a pretty good cycle, and this wouldn't take too long. I'm just going to show the one because this is a little tedious, and it's going to take some time to go through all of these, especially since I'm going to rotate and lock the motor, which means I got to get underneath and set the flywheel lock. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I just wanted to kind of show you how it goes and some of the stuff to kind of look at when you're doing it. It's a pretty straightforward thing. This particular spring is basically going to be a drop-in and give me the room I need, and I'm going to be good to go. So at this point, I'm done with the video, and if there's a question, put it in the comments section. And I'm going to go ahead and finish up this work and move on to the next task. Talk to you later. Bye.